Okay, so we've talked about minimizing threats to experimental internal validity, at least the ones we can minimize. And the way to do that is through good and careful research design. But now we're going to consider some generic kinds of research design. So for our purposes, I've broken it down into three main categories of research designs shown on this slide: pre-experimental, true experiments, and quasi-experiments. And in all three of these main categories, there are many different types of studies that have been named and described. But for our purposes, I just want to make sure you have the general categories and a few examples of each. So as you see on the slide, the first example up here is pre-experimental. We're going to talk about three types of pre-experimental studies: case studies, one group pre-test, post-test studies, and very simple and crude observational or correlational studies. The next category here is true experiments, probably the kinds of experiments that come into most people's minds when they think of research. And lastly, we have quasi-experiments, and these include observational or correlational studies that are much more sophisticated than these up here that would in fact be included in the pre-experimental category. Starting with case studies. Case studies, of course, are just a description and analysis of one particular subject, one particular case. So this might be a good place to start, but a case study alone is not really science. And we saw essentially a case study in that Arizona case on repressed memory, right? In which the Arizona Supreme Court thought, well, that's good enough for admitting that psychiatrist's testimony in court. The modern scientific evidence chapter on Blackboard uses a case study example about vitamin C involving someone who has a cold. One person who has a cold being given large doses of vitamin C, and then a few days later, oh, lo and behold, the cold is gone. So we can all understand why a case study like this should not be relied on as evidence that vitamin C cures colds. I mean, this is really no different than someone with a cold being bled with leeches and then getting better. Neither one of these examples really tells you what effect, if any, the vitamin C or leeches had, right? The colds could have been cured by bed rest or drinking fluids. Those, of course, would be history confounds, by the way. Most likely, just the person's immune system cured the cold, and that is going to be a maturity confound. It's common, though, to see a sort of case study approach used in advertising in particular, and these ads can seem quite convincing, and people do seem to respond to individual stories rather than generalized information about a product or a drug, for better or worse. So here on the top left, we have the Bowflex guy who lost all the weight and got this body from 20 minutes a day on the Bowflex. You might remember that television commercial. On the top in the middle here, we see an example of an ad for one of the drugs marketed for use in children to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's very, very common to see a particular child's case described in these ads, probably a hypothetical child. And as you might know, the use of these drugs has become a very controversial topic the last few years, with many scientists and doctors saying that we are over-medicating children and giving the drugs to children who shouldn't actually be getting them just because we want to exert behavioral control over kids. But just as with other prescription drugs, the ability of pharmaceutical companies to advertise has increased the demand for medications, with people following the ad's advice and asking their doctors if XYZ drug might be right for them. I'm sure you're well familiar with that phrase. All right, on the top right over here, we have, in fact, one of the most famous case studies of all time, Freud's Anna O, and she was diagnosed with hysteria that was apparently cured by talking therapy with Freud, which, of course, led to the development of Freudian analysis. Down here on the bottom of the slide from right to left, we have Bob of Enzyte male enhancement fame. Kathy here, the depressed white blob who is miraculously cured by Zoloft, an antidepressant in the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor class, another controversial area, by the way, since many randomized controlled trials show that antidepressants in many cases don't work better than a placebo. And then, of course, finally over here we have former NFL quarterback Steve Young extolling the virtues of Advil. So, all right, despite concerns that we might have about case studies in advertising, case studies can be very good for generating hypotheses, right, and getting a feel for a subject area. And certainly sometimes cases are chosen for study because they are unusual or particularly interesting cases. So you might validly, get an idea to study something because you observe something unusual. But you do run into problems scientifically if you try to use just case studies to then validate your hypotheses, right? The value in any case study or even a series of case studies depends entirely on the researcher, and there's no way for a third person to know the validity or to replicate that work. And of course, there are no control groups or comparison groups, so you can never tell what the results would have been had the author or the researcher chosen a different case. It's sort of like the difference between your cousin telling you, oh yeah, my friend Bob owned a Honda Civic and he loved it and never had a breakdown in 8 years, right? That's a case study versus the Consumer Reports analysis of the safety and reliability of the Honda Civic, which of course is going to include long-term group data. So with case studies, one frustrating thing for reputable scientists is that case studies can often be incredibly vivid and therefore can have an enormous effect on the reader or the listener or on a consumer. In the case of things like commercials featuring one person telling a story about some ailment or some awful headache or back pain, and this particular drug or muscle cream worked for him or her, especially a famous person. And this can lead to misinformation being spread and actual scientific data that might not be as sexy getting, in fact, ignored altogether. But obviously, again, one or even a handful of anecdotal reports, not hypothesis testing. So, an interesting case study is a place to start, but then you have to gather enough data in hopefully a controlled and randomized manner to support or falsify that initial hypothesis that you formed from your case. Okay, I put the one group pre-test, post-test design up here as an example of a study that is so weak that it would really be considered pre-experimental because it's subject to just so many confounds. So in this design, what you have is only one group of subjects is used. So this group of subjects up here, they are pre-tested on the dependent variable and then post-tested over here after the treatment or intervention has been administered. And you see the cartoon here that says, if you do a one group pre-test, post-test design, you're gonna have a bad time. For those of you who aren't South Park fans, you might look that up and watch the South Park episode clip with the ski instructor who repeatedly uses this phrase and then became this internet meme. All right, but with regard to this kind of study, using the vitamin C example, an example would be, let's say you take 100 people that you've chosen because they have colds, right? People have colds. This is going to be your pre-test phase over here. Then you give them all high doses of vitamin C here, then test them a week later over here for your post-test phase. Well, maybe you find that 50 of them don't have colds anymore. But I'm sure what you're seeing here is that the exact same confounds that were there in our one-person vitamin C case study are still here, right? But frankly, there are even more possible confounds, I think, applicable to a multiple subject study, like mortality, for example. You can't assume that people are dropping out for a random reason when it's not a random sample to start with. Still, though, the major problem is that the study just doesn't give you much support at all for causation, right? I mean, not having a comparison group, for example, of people with colds who are given a placebo and see what happens with them, that's an obvious flaw. Okay, the last type of pre-experimental designs I want to mention are the static group design, which is really just a weak observational or correlation study. So in a static group study, you take two groups, one of whose members has been exposed to a certain thing or subject to a certain treatment in the past, okay, which is depicted here by X. So you've got your group, and a lot of times this is going to rely on self-reports, okay? So you take one group who has been exposed to a certain thing or subject to a certain treatment in the past, and then your group down here, you see there's nothing here, whose members hasn't been subjected or exposed. And then you see, well, how do these two groups compare on some certain measure? So there is no control in this kind of study by a researcher here about who ends up in the two groups. So much of the time, it's just going to be people who have self-selected at some point in the past. For example, you might want to look at people who have smoked 2 packs a day for the last 10 years and compare them to people who've never smoked. Now, you as the researcher, if you're doing this kind of study, you're just going to take the groups as you find them. You're going to categorize them based on your design, and you're not paying attention here to whether people in the groups might be different from each other in other characteristics, which is a problem. So again, in our vitamin C example, a researcher might recruit people who say they have been taking at or above a certain dose of vitamin C for at least some minimum period of time, and then have a control group of sorts with people who have not been taking a vitamin C, and then follow them for 6 months to see how many colds people in the two groups get. All right, so there's no random assignment to groups here. You're usually just measuring one variable of interest at a certain point in time or maybe over a period of time. And obviously this is going to be subject to a lot of internal validity threats. That history threat might be there in that you have no way of knowing how your two groups might differ aside from that one independent variable you're naming, right? People who take vitamin C might do other things to keep healthy, like getting 8 hours of sleep a night, exercising, and for that matter, taking other kinds of vitamins or supplements even. And that's a history confound. Somewhat related to that might be the selection confound of being healthier to start with. Or if their immune systems are stronger due to factors other than the vitamin C regimen, there might be a maturation confound in that they fight off any viruses they are exposed to in a more efficient and quick way. So on the slide are a couple of quotes from one of the classic research methods books, Campbell and Stanley. These quotes are from 1963, but I do think they really well describe the problem with this research design. So I would like you to pause the video right now and just read these quotes. Okay, so now you've read the quotes. So just to recap, the static group design study is essentially observational, right? Can't strongly support a cause and effect claim. It's also really a correlational study in that you're looking at groups along one measure and seeing if the differences in that measure are correlated with some other difference, like whether the group taking vitamin C has overall a lower number of colds. Okay, so I am going to stop this video here and do a slightly longer video for the last one. So this is the end of video number 2.